Trifles in Minnie's Defense by Heather Lewis. I'm going to be discussing why Minnie's actions of murdering her husband were justified. Although it's never really okay to kill someone, she did have very good reasons for doing so. Minnie's decision to kill her husband was justified by a lot of evidence found in the play. Miss Hale and Miss Peters were right to help her go free because they understood what she was going through and what it was like to be a woman in that time period. The evidence. There is a lot of evidence showing the reasons for Minnie's actions and how they are justified. I believe the following things were the most significant pieces of evidence in the play: isolation, a messy kitchen, nervous stitching, the canary, and the dead canary. Isolation. Isolation plays an important role in the play and contributes greatly to Minnie's mental state. Imagine having no family or friends close by, no one to talk to or to express your feelings to. Eventually, this would take a toll on anyone. In this time period, there weren't many opportunities for women to leave and get out of the house. So much of the time, they had little group meetings in town to socialize. Where they lived, they had a group called the Ladies' Aid. Miss Hill states she didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. Minnie and John were also poor. They didn't have much money for nice clothes and things, and she probably did feel shabby and maybe even embarrassed to go into town because of this. Her neighbors also lived far away and didn't visit often, because the place never felt like a cheerful place, according to Miss Hill, one of her closest neighbors. Around this time is also when they started using telephones. But John didn't really want a telephone. He had stated at one point in this play that people talk too much anyways, and he just wanted some peace and quiet. So they didn't have any way to contact anyone unless they went out, and Minnie never went out, so this left her alone much of the time. The messy kitchen. The messy kitchen plays a very important piece of evidence in this play. The reason being is because women in this time period were to stay home and do all the household chores, and men had to go to work and earn the money to support his family. So the women took a lot of pride in their homes, and especially in their kitchen, since this is where they spent most of their time. This was also how you were considered to be a good wife or not. If you had a messy home, then you were considered irresponsible and lazy, especially by the men. In the play, we see an example of this when the men come to investigate and they make comments about the roller towels and the mess. So, why was the kitchen so messy anyways? Well, Minnie was probably feeling tired and overwhelmed with all the work there was to do on the farm, and then John came home in a bad mood and upset her, and she just never got the chance to finish all the chores. Unfortunately, the men never made the connection with the messy kitchen and that there might have been something more going on that night than just her being lazy. Nervous stitching. Her nervous stitching is also a very important piece of evidence in the play. Quilting was probably one of the only things she enjoyed doing in her free time. When Miss Hale and Miss Peters came across her quilting, most of the pieces were nice and straight, but others were not. The stitching was very messy and loose. This signaled to Miss Hale that something must have been bothering her. After everything that had happened that night, I believe Minnie sat down to work on her quilt, in hopes that would calm her nerves and she would be able to collect her thoughts. But all she could think about was what John had done to upset her, causing her so much anger and anxiety and not to be able to focus on her stitches. The men also didn't make the correlation with the nervous stitching because they didn't really understand quilting was not something that they did, so they kept making jokes like, "Is she going to quilt it or not it, ladies?" The Canary. The canary was the only friend Minnie had at the time. This was the only thing she had to love other than her grumpy old husband, who was never around much. Lane A. Glenn describes him as a stern and antisocial farmer. Miss Hale states, "Come to think of it, Minnie was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but timid and fluttery." She's thinking back to a time when Minnie used to take pride in herself and put little bows in her hair and wear pretty dresses and sing in the choir. She was much more lively at this time. But then she ended up in a loveless marriage with John and became sad and depressed, and the only thing that she had to relate to and to talk to and to keep her company was the little canary. And unfortunately, John had to take that away from her too. The Dead Canary. So, why did John kill her little canary? I believe he killed her little canary because he came home from a bad day and the little bird was singing and fluttering around in his cage. He got annoyed by this and forcefully took the bird out of the cage and broke its neck, which is why Miss Hale and Miss Peters had found the broken bird cage in the closet. This ended up being the breaking point for Minnie. She wrapped the little bird in a piece of silk and placed it in a little wooden box under her quilt pieces. As she sat there trying to gather her thoughts and feelings, she felt so much anger and resentment towards her husband John that she went in while he was sleeping and strangled him with a rope. I believe she chose strangulation because he had suffocated and strangled her for so many years. And now he had strangled her little bird, and she couldn't deal with her feelings any longer, which unfortunately led to her murdering her husband. So, why did Miss Hale help cover up John's murder? Miss Hale knew what kind of man John was, and even though he wasn't a bad man and had a good reputation, she says he kept his word, like most, and he didn't drink. Miss Hale describes him also as being cold and not caring much for what his wife wanted. From the statements Miss Hale makes, John was not a very loving or compassionate person. She also knew how hard it was to be a farmer's wife during this time. Even though Miss Hale seemed to be in a loving marriage, she was still able to sympathize with Minnie because she too was also a farmer's wife and knew how much work there was to be done around the farm. One incident in the story, the men were criticizing Minnie for being a bad housekeeper, and Miss Hill explains there's a great deal of work to be done around the farm. And she also says, "I'd hate having men coming into my kitchen and snooping around and criticizing," because she knew what it was like and how much work it took to keep the house and everything clean. She also knows how much Minnie started to suffer from being alone all the time. She even blamed herself for not coming to see Minnie more often, but she just couldn't shake the feeling that the house seemed so uncheerful. Miss Peters, and being able to relate with Minnie. Before they found the dead canary, Miss Peters was having a hard time sympathizing with Minnie because she could not relate to her like Miss Hill was able to. She hadn't been living in the town long. She was the sheriff's wife and had no idea what it was like to be alone and isolated all the time. But after listening to Miss Hale and seeing the dead canary, she was finally able to relate and understand why Minnie had snapped. She says, "When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy who took a hatchet, and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him." This is when she's finally able to realize how much Minnie's little bird meant to her and why she had snapped. And at the end, she was able to keep quiet about the things that they had found and tampered with and hid the dead canary in her dress so the sheriff and the attorney would not find them, because this is crucial evidence to the case on prosecuting Minnie for the murder that she had committed. In conclusion, all of the evidence found throughout the play helps justify Minnie's actions for killing her husband. Isolation played a huge role, and I think that's ultimately what drove her insane. And then after John killed her little bird, that was pretty much the icing on the cake, and she just couldn't take any more. Miss Hale was able to sympathize and understand Minnie's position and how hard her life must have been. And Miss Peters was finally able to relate after seeing the dead canary and hid the evidence that would have been used to convict Minnie of the murder of her husband. But since they were able to keep quiet and hide the evidence that they had found, now Minnie can live freely and no longer feel trapped and alone. And this is my works cited page. I thank you all for listening and hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Hope you all have a great summer.